European traveler. You just got back from France.
Yes, I did.
See, I don't see you going to France.
Well,
Do you get along with the French people okay? Because they're pretty liberal over there. Are they not?
I'll tell you some interesting stuff. My wife and I went over to France for 2 weeks, and I'll talk about going over there after I'm back. I won't talk about going out of town before I go because I don't want somebody breaking in my house. So, at any rate, I went over there, and I went to high school in France. So I had kind of a head start.
Was you a Rhodes Scholar, or what would put you in high school in France?
I prefer the Rhodes Scholar, but my dad was in the Air Force and he was stationed in France, and I went to the American school in Paris as a boarder. I was at a boarding school there for American military dependents and State Department dependents. So it was good. I enjoyed it while I was there, but that's been many, many years ago when all of the French I was able to speak at that time is long gone. Mm-hmm. But I was determined that I was going to try to speak French. And so here's what I would say to people. J'essaie de parler français. Mm-hmm. Aidez-moi, s'il vous plaît. That means I'm trying to speak French. Help me, please. Mm-hmm. And so I'd sit there and rattle off what I thought was pretty impressive French. They'd look at me like, huh? And then my wife would walk up and start speaking English. They'd quit listening to me and start talking to her in English.
Yeah, I found that out over there too, because you hear all these this urban legend that they won't talk to you unless you speak the native tongue. It's just not true.
Unless you try.
They don't. You know what?
Want to speak English or French. And I said, oh, j'essaie de parler français. Aidez-moi, s'il vous plaît. And so then he just started rattling off in French, and I said, doucement. He says, let's just do English.
That's much easier.
So, yeah. But when I was there, I would get the International New York Times, which is an English newspaper that they have over there, and I picked up a couple of newspapers from England. And let me tell you something. This is what this one said. The title is, "The Skull Cracker Has Smashed Our Fading Trust in Jail Sentences. The spectacular disappearance and rearrest of the thug known as the Skull Cracker is a stark reminder that something in our criminal justice system is seriously awry. There now seems to be almost no connection between the seriousness of crime, the sentence that's passed, the sentence that's been given to a criminal, and the time they spend in jail. They're doing the same thing there that we're doing here in Kentucky.
Now, where's there?
This is in London.
Okay.
Yeah. Now, we stayed in a place called Tours. We went to South France and started there and spent 2 or 3 days in a city called Avignon. Then we took a train up to a place called Tours, T-O-U-R, and we stayed in this little hotel, and we checked in the evening, and I told the guy my name, Ray Larson, signed in. Next morning, I came down, and he says, "Oh, ho, ho, Ray the DA."
Really?
Yeah. He had Googled.
I see.
And had spent because he's on the desk at night and there's almost nothing going on. He spent most of the night reading our webpage because he spoke English very well. And I said, and he wanted to talk about a couple of things. And that is the fact that in France, the people who commit crimes are almost never punished. And he wanted to talk about the death penalty because he saw it on our webpage that the killers of death row. And he said, first of all, police don't seem to care much about catching murderers or that sort of thing. And he says, we don't have the death penalty. But he said, the citizens would like it. But it's just that the ruling class over there won't let us vote on it. And but I had done some research, and there's only one European country that would not reinstitute the death penalty if people were allowed to vote on it, and that's Italy. And that was 51% against, 49% for. So it's right there.
Still close, isn't it?
Yeah, yeah. But the rest of the countries, they want the death penalty. I'm telling you, it's just. Here's what they say: the steady politicization of sentencing policy has created a system of monstrous complexity. I mean, this is in their newspapers over there. And then in another one of these, New York Times. Think about New York Times. New York Times is a super liberal newspaper. And it's no different over there. And there is a article that was written by somebody named Joe Nesbo. Just a pointless instinct. It's an example of our capacity for abstract thought. Avenging misdeeds, we don't regain what we have lost, but we ensure that misdeeds have consequences. See? So I'm sensing, and this is in the newspaper. You don't see any of these kind of things in our newspapers over here. These editorial boards and politically correct folks are too afraid to do that.
I had a conversation with a police officer in London, England, and he had an interesting take on things. He told me, you were talking about police morale over there, and this one citizen saying that in France in particular, that he just didn't feel like the police cared.
No, that's not what he said. He said it's not that they didn't care, it's just that the courts
were just sort of helpless.
Mm-hmm.
What this officer in London told me was that policing there is not about punishment as much as it is about raising money. He said everything is about fines and who they can get money out of. Punishment is not really the issue. So if you had people who can't afford the fine, then they just basically write it off because nobody goes to jail. But if you've got a citizen who can afford to pay, then that person has to pay a fine.
So they buy justice.
It's a tax. It's basically they feel
Crime
like
tax.
tax collectors. But there again, it's the tax doesn't apply to those who choose not to pay their fines and can't afford it, because they just won't lock anybody up. I mean, that's the bottom line. And they had that one incident where those two thugs chopped up that soldier with knives and machetes or whatever. It took them 20 minutes to get a police officer there with a gun to deal with these two people. Oh. It took 20 minutes. It took for them to find a police officer that was armed because there's so few and far between in that country. So they have a whole different view of policing. But unfortunately, some of that we're seeing over here too. I mean, especially where you get to where the fines get raised on crimes. For instance, operating on suspended. 15 years ago, that was something that a police officer would arrest you for, and that was your incentive not to drive if your license is suspended. Now it's another ticket, and if you don't pay the ticket, then I guess it's a summons, and if you don't come to court, then it's another summons, and then eventually it just gets buried in the system and written off. I mean, that's what's happening. So the same thing. We're seeing the same trend here. Wouldn't you agree?
Sure, absolutely. And it's I had a fellow called me up and was absolutely astounded that somebody that breaks into a car gets a ticket? And I said, well, yes. I said, no, and this is what I always say. Do you know who your legislator is? And he said, well, I used to. And I said, well, that's not helpful. I said, you know who your senator is? And he says, no. I said, look, you need to find out who those people are, and if you don't like it, you got to say something. Sitting around complaining to me doesn't help, because I'm complaining too.
Well, I think if you're a police officer and you've been told that this is something that you write a ticket for, that's not going to be a priority for a police officer. You know, it's like, really? So breaking into cars is not something that I should arrest people for anymore. And you can't help it. It's not trying to push back or have a bad attitude. You're going to move on to things that the legislature has told you are more important. You know, and that's the message that they send to our cops too. And that's the real downside to what's going on with how they've arranged things, where they want to write tickets for crimes that people should be arrested for. Period. They should be arrested on the spot and then brought before the judge. But that's just not how it is right now.
Well, it's not happening. The guy that caused all of this is Lewis Gill. Could have been behind bars if the judge who sentenced him earlier that year for robbery had put him behind bars. Instead, he was given a suspended sentence. This is in England.
This is what'd you call this guy?
The skullcracker.
The skullcracker. Why'd they call him a skullcracker?
Well, I'll tell you. Instead, he was given a suspended sentence, left him free to walk on the streets and kill a man with a single punch. This is that knockout game that's going on here. They call them skullcrackers in England. He smashed an Asperger's sufferer in the face after that Asperger's sufferer, who had the mental age of a young teenager, fussed at the guy's girlfriend about riding his bicycle on the pavement. The bad guy hit the guy in the face, fractured skull, and was next day died in the hospital. And here's what the mother of this guy says, and this is what I like to say: the judicial system is such a soft touch. I like it. Yeah, I like this person. Problem is that you and me and the police and everybody else are going to have to pick up this torch, punishment for lawbreakers, which has been obviously dropped and abandoned by the people we elected. They've abandoned the beliefs of the people who elected them and no longer represent us. They represent their own interests. And so, you know, and when I was in France, these are the exact kind of things that causes revolutions. Now, I don't mean shooting and that kind of stuff, but there has got to be a revolution in thinking about whether or not we're going to ignore criminal acts and let people just get away with it, or are we going to cause people to suffer consequences for doing it? That's the question.
Well, I wish you could have relaxed more in France.
I did.
Okay.
I did.
Sounds like you're working.
Well, I read the paper, and I happened to go find a highlighter. Mm-hmm. And so I'd tear these things out, and my wife said, "Would you lighten up?" And I said, "This is fun. This is light."
We'll see you next week on In Time.